10 disasters waiting to happen. Number 10. The big one. The west coast of America is no stranger to an earthquake or two. But while it's one thing for a little rumble and quite a bit worse for a seismic event to shake a city's foundations, there's something else entirely on the horizon that could wreak untold destruction. The big one. According to a 2006 paper by Yuri Fialko in the journal Nature, the San Andreas fault line is overdue a quake of historic proportions. Literally historic. Ruptures have occurred roughly every 150 years or so over time, with the northern and central parts of the fault having seen them as recently as 1857 and 1906. But it's been more than 250 years for the southern portion, so there's more built-up tension there than a bad marriage. Predicted at 7.8 magnitude on the Richter scale, this catastrophically late bloomer could cause around 2,000 deaths in California and more than $200 billion in damages. Even worse, recent lower magnitude tremors in California showed up just how unprepared the state is for the big one. The majority of people there don't have emergency supplies, and only around 20% of them are insured. In other words, we've got the makings of a real-life Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson movie on our hands, but the trailer just says coming soon. Number 9. Metsamor nuclear power plant. Nuclear power is a vital part of modern life for people all around the world, but it does come along with some serious, albeit manageable, risk. That risk has never been more visible than in Ukraine during the Chernobyl crisis, which showed the world just how threatening a failure at a nuclear power plant could be. But less well known is the danger posed by Armenia's Metsamor facility. While not the same model as Chernobyl, Metsamor actually uses the earliest design of nuclear plant created in the Soviet Union, and the only one outside of Russia that's still in operation. But what makes it such a concern is that it sits in one of the most seismically active regions on the planet, meaning an overly close earthquake could lead to a serious failure. Given it's just 20 miles or 36 kilometers from the 1 million strong capital of Yerevan, you can see the risks. Plans are underway to replace the plant with a less catastrophically dangerous one, but it's the unique position of providing 40% of the country's energy. As such, it cannot be decommissioned until the replacement's up and running, whenever that might be. Number 8. Dam collapse. Despite being the crux of at least 40% of action movie villains' plans, dam collapse isn't just some fantastical Hollywood catastrophe. There's actually a real risk of dams around the world failing and leaving thousands of people at risk. Right now, the planet is full of dams built before 1900, which are naturally going to have lower standards of protection and less developed technology to do the protecting. For example, we know that they're designed to deal with so-called 1 in 100 year flood events. Well, floods of that level are occurring around the world roughly every 5 years. I won't bore you with why, but let's just say it rhymes with primate strange. I don't know, moving on. Globally, there have been 40 dam collapses since the year 2000, which have caused hundreds of deaths. Most recently in 2019, the British town of Whaley Bridge had to be evacuated after flooding led to what the Environment Agency called a real risk of collapse. With flooding events already happening 4 times more often than in 1980, that risk is only going to keep mounting, as will its potential death toll. Number 7. Global disease epidemic. In case you hadn't noticed, human beings are pretty fragile. All kinds of things can wind up killing us, from a stubbed toe to a common cold. And on a not unrelated note, the world is actually surprisingly vulnerable to devastation at the hands of disease. According to Boston University professor Jonathan Quick, an airborne disease could reach 25,000 people in 1 week, 700,000 in 1 month, and 300 million people over 6 months in every urban centre. Tech pioneer turned Uber charity man Bill Gates estimates that the likelihood of a catastrophic epidemic inside his lifetime, so probably in the next 30 years, is more than 50%. According to Quick, this is more likely than it should be, mostly because of fear, complacency, and financial self-interest. For example, there are more immediately useful ways to spend government money than on preparing for a plague that may or may not happen. That's even though that makes the may part of that a lot more likely, and that's especially true because the poor are the most likely victims, but likely can't afford immunisation. I guess all I could suggest is becoming a hermit, maybe? At least that gives you all the time to watch the all-time 10s back catalogue. Number 6. Tower block collapse. It's pretty fair to say that construction methods have gotten more advanced over the years, but that does mean there are some pretty dangerous skeletons in the architectural closet dating back a few decades. Take the UK for example. After tower block safety made the headlines due to a number of deaths in 2017, an independent audit found that nearly 600 high-rise buildings containing as many as 41,000 apartments were, and still are, at risk of structural failure. That's because of a flawed construction method employed in the 60s and 70s called the large panel system, which have now degraded to the point where residents can fit their entire arms through cracks in the walls. If one of these apartments was to experience a fire or gas explosion, there's a high likelihood that it would collapse the whole building. That already happened in 1968, when a gas explosion cascaded to destroy the whole southeast corner of a tower block. This is, by the way, in the 5th largest economy in the world, and there are tens of thousands of apartments just one fire away from dropping to the ground. Just imagine how bad it could be elsewhere. Number 5. Demographic time bomb. So I've got good news and bad news for you. The good news is that people around the world are living for longer than ever. The bad news is that less and less people are having kids. This trend is generally called the demographic time bomb, since eventually many developed countries are going to reach a point where there simply aren't enough able-bodied people to take care of the old and infirm. That means a lot of older people dying before their time. Japan is the headline example of this, with both a skyrocketing average age and a plummeting population. In the year 2000, 1.5% of the country was over 85. By 2070, that's going to reach around 9%, or roughly 8.1 million people. That's true of the US too, whose birth rate has dropped from 2.12 to 1.76 in the last decade, and the average birthing age in some parts of the country is as high as 32. Or take Finland, where there are actually more deaths than births annually, and the gap is widening every year. So we better get working on those AI carers, so long as it doesn't get all iRobot or any other science fiction film. Number 4. Global recession. Who can forget 2008? Katy Perry broke her way into pop culture, shutter shades blighted faces across the world. And the world suffered the most crippling financial collapse in 8 decades. Good times. That crash made living conditions considerably worse worldwide and led to millions of deaths due to starvation, healthcare cuts, and now there are widespread predictions among economists that 2020 could see another financial crisis. At least there's still Katy Perry. That's largely on the back of the ongoing trade war between the US and China, which is making stock markets seriously worried. On top of that, if the signs of war between the US and Iran actually come to fruition, the resulting oil price shock could be the uppercut that sees the US economy down for the count. There's also the real risk that China bursts its own bubble, since, according to economist Grace Blakely, Xi Jinping has essentially traded unstable growth for a temporarily satisfied middle class. With that in mind, if the two biggest economies in the world dip, you can bet it's going to have some ripple effects for all of us. Best start stocking up on canned goods, because you're going to need them. Number 3. Bridge collapse. You may have noticed that a lot of the things we use every single day in public life are pretty worse for wear. That means we're living pretty precarious day-to-day lives when it comes to ports, railways, airports, dams, as we've already seen, and in this case, bridges. In recent years, the world has seen several high-profile cases of dangerous bridges unexpectedly caving, which some might dismiss as a fluke, but the evidence suggests it's part of a trend that could end in tears. For example, the US has more than 54,000 bridges that are deemed structurally deficient. That's 9% of all bridges in the country, and it would take 37 years to fix or replace them at the current rate. And what's worse than that, 2017 research from Stanford University found that methods of assessing flood risk on bridges actually underestimates the risk. So basically, there are loads of dodgy bridges, and they're probably even less safe than we think. Maybe don't think about that too much on your way home. Number 2. Catastrophic cyber attack. In the modern day, warfare has evolved to the point where physical assaults are just one of a complex web of tactics, which includes cyberspace. As such, the use of hacking, DDoS attacks, and cyber espionage is only going to become a more pressing threat over time. According to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, that's becoming particularly pressing for the US, since Russia and China are developing capacities for some serious attacks. The 2019 report claims that Moscow is now staging cyber attack assets to allow it to disrupt or damage US civilian and military military infrastructure during a crisis. It's already shown it has the capability to do this after doing exactly the same thing to Ukraine in 2015. Beyond that, we saw the 2017 North Korean-backed WannaCry malware wreak havoc on Windows systems worldwide, including large parts of the UK's NHS computer system. And outside of national security, the World Economic Forum has stated that cyber attacks are the biggest risk to businesses around the world. So, whether it's nation-states, organised crime, or lone wolves, there's a looming, potentially massive threat that can't quite be pinned down. Number 1. EMP attack. In the halcyon days of the Cold War, the prospect of nuclear annihilation was pretty much ever present in the lives of Americans. But fast forward to the current day, and there's a different, though not unrelated threat to worry about. I'm talking about EMP, or electromagnetic pulses. In other words, a burst of electromagnetic energy that's capable of crippling power grids and national infrastructures, especially if it's weaponized. And unlike nukes, which we spend a lot of time and resources preparing for, EMP attacks are a serious blind spot. In a 2008 EMP Commission report outlining the severity of the threat, there were more than 100 recommendations made to Congress over how to shore up things like electricity services. Without those measures, Committee Chairman William R. Graham says an EMP would be a civilization killer. And guess how many were implemented by 2015? 0. Yet, as a result, a second commission had to be created to approach an even more pressing threat unprepared. For example, the US military now has to deal with a North Korean EMP threat, which is about the last place you would want it to come from. So those were 10 disasters waiting to happen. Which do you think is the most likely? Have we made you paranoid? Let us know in the comments down below. Be sure to subscribe to All Time 10s if you haven't done so already, and click on the bell so YouTube can let you know when we've got a new video out. In the meantime though, here is another video up there now.